This is the video about boredom, and what if I told you that boredom is good for you, and it can actually increase your productivity, brain power, creativity, problem-solving ability, and much, much more. But the question is how? To understand this first, let's understand what actually boredom is. Well, contrary to popular belief, it's not when you have absolutely nothing to do. It's just when none of the options you have available to you appeal to you. Boredom is characterized by a lack of concentration, restlessness, but also feeling lethargic. And there are now more ways than ever to avoid boredom with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube. Specifically, we need to understand two neural networks called the default mode network and the executive function network. The executive functions network describes a set of cognitive processes and mental skills that help an individual plan, monitor, and successfully execute their goals. This includes attentional control, working memory, inhibition, and problem solving. Then we have default mode network, which is the part of our brain active when our attention is not directed by external stimuli. And this is important because when we're not processing external information, it means our memory becomes the primary source of our thoughts and images. In a few moments, I will share few scientific studies and experiments with you that will further clarify this concept. But for now, just think about all the random thoughts that pop into your head right before bed or when you're in the shower with nothing to look at. True creativity is born when our thoughts are allowed to wander inward without external stimulation distracting us. Anyhow, it's the ability to connect unrelated pieces of information in new and novel ways. And since an IBM study of 1,000 CEOs found that creativity is the most valuable skill in the modern workforce, it's well worth our time and energy discovering new ways to expand our creativity. Which leads us to the first psychological study I stumbled upon a few years ago that absolutely changed my life. This study from 2014 was aptly named, "Does being bored make us more creative?" And as it turns out, it does. To determine this, researchers split participants into two groups. One was asked to copy phone numbers out of a phone book by hand, while the other was asked to read them out loud. Now, both of these are pretty boring tasks, but reading numbers out loud is considered more boring because you're not as actively engaged as when you're writing something down by hand. In the second stage of the study, researchers conducted a fluency task where participants had a couple of minutes to come up with as many creative uses for a brick as possible. Like you could use it to build a wall or a paperweight or a baseball or bludgeoning weapon or a flower pot. Whatever your imagination is literally the limit. Now, the study found that both the phone number writing group and the speaking group outperformed the control group who didn't go through any boredom preconditioning. But even more interesting is that the speaking group, the group that was supposedly more bored, they came up with the longest list of creative uses for the brick. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, it's simple. Boredom enhances creativity, which in turn enhances the value of the work that you produce. So you start to see the way that you outwork people is by producing more value than them in the same period of time, which is important because we all have the same amount of time in the day. So the idea that you can outperform anybody by putting in more hours is completely idiotic. I know plenty of people working 2 and even 3 jobs where they just grind around the clock. There's literally no more time in the day for them to work. The problem is they're working on the wrong things, because here's the truth. Success isn't about how much you get done. It's about what you get done. And this is why creativity is such a high-value skill. But here's the problem. As Blaise Pascal pointed out, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And to prove this, we turn to the second psychological study. Timothy Wilson and his team put participants alone in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but a button. A button that, if they pressed, would shock them. Now, before the study even began, the majority of the participants said that they would be willing to pay money to avoid being shocked. And yet, once the study commenced, 67% of men and 25% of women chose to shock themselves. And this disparity in the gender's willingness to inflict pain on themselves, it might be the reason why women tend to live longer than men, but I don't know. Now the question is, why on earth would people rather inflict pain on themselves than to just sit with their boredom? And to understand this, we have to go back to why the human brain ever evolved the capacity to feel boredom in the first place. And you've really got to wonder, because boredom is often described as a very unpleasant state where you feel simultaneously stressed and agitated and at the same time lethargic. So what exactly is the evolutionary advantage to feeling bored? Now, there's a bunch of thoughts on this topic, but the leading theory, and the one that makes the most sense to me, is that boredom serves as a motivational factor to go and actually do stuff. In particular, there's two things that would have served our ancestors very well. The first is to experiment with new and novel things, such as new foods or experiences, or venturing into the unknown. And this is important because trial and error is the overpowered strategy that nature has used to develop every living organism on this planet over the last couple billion years. If it's good enough for the universe, it's good enough for us. And this leads to the second benefit of boredom, which is that it induces more introspection in time spent thinking about the future. Another word for this is daydreaming. Daydreaming is a fascinating concept that might not seem like that big of a deal until you consider the fact that humans are the only creature on this planet that we know of with the ability to daydream. But what exactly is daydreaming? Well, here's a very simple definition. Daydreaming is a state of decoupled processing in which attention to ongoing perceptual information, also known as the things you're perceiving outside of yourself, are reduced in favor of the active consideration of internally generated thoughts and feelings. Now, does this sound an awful lot like the default mode network, which is the part of the brain responsible for creativity? Well, yes, it does. Because of all these concepts, boredom, creativity, and daydreaming, they're all interconnect routed through the same neural network. Now, studies show that daydreaming boosts creativity, problem-solving skills, and increases your ability to focus on a specific task. Unfortunately, most of us probably grew up thinking daydreaming was bad because our well-meaning parents and our teachers, they're probably always yelling at us to stop drifting off and to just pay attention. Now, knowing boredom is important is one thing, but acting on it is something else entirely. Because remember, being bored really sucks, which is why most of us turn into dopamine-seeking missiles. The second we feel that twinge of boredom when we're standing in line at the coffee shop, or waiting in the elevator, or sitting at a red light, and the drug we all typically reach for straight into our eyeballs is none other than our phones. So every time you're waiting for something, you have a decision to make, which seems like a tiny one. Pull out your phone for a few seconds or minutes, or just be bored and experience only your thoughts. It seems like an insignificant decision. And if you don't give it much thought, the obvious action is to see what's new on your app of choice. And in making that decision, you are alleviating a moment of boredom. In short, you are the real-world example of someone shocking themselves to avoid the unpleasantness of boredom. Except in your case, the pain goes much deeper to the very nature of who you are and who you will become. So think carefully before pressing that button for yourself. But there is still a problem left. If you have any kind of addiction like smoking, drinking alcohol, or video games, sitting with your own thoughts would be way more difficult. That's why you must break those habits, and for exactly that reason, I have made this video which will help you break any addiction. So must check it out.